Okay, let's unpack this. When you picture a faun, maybe, maybe it's that gentle flute-playing creature from a fantasy story, right?
Yeah, the kind with goat legs, maybe a kind face.
Well,
Mr. Tumnus often comes to mind.
exactly. But what if that image, that familiar picture, is actually pretty modern?
And what if the ancient roots of these nature spirits like fauns and pan are, well, a lot more complex, maybe even a bit unsettling?
That's precisely where we're going today. We've got some fascinating source material here. It takes us on quite a journey.
Right, starting with modern paganism's deep reverence for nature, its spirits.
Then digging into the ancient mythology around figures like fauns, satyrs, Pan.
And then, yeah, a sharp turn into the shadows. Gothic and horror fiction,
Mm.
specifically Arthur Macon's novel, The Great God Pan, which is genuinely disturbing stuff.
So our mission here, connect these dots, which might seem pretty far apart at first glance.
We want to explore how that ancient view of nature, its wildness, its, unpredictable inhabitants.
How that becomes fertile ground for terror in literature.
Exactly. And we'll look at the really clever ways Macon used narrative techniques to tap into what feel like our deepest, oldest fears.
Yeah. We're drawing on an article about paganism and nature, another one on faun mythology, and then this academic analysis of Macon's novel as horror.
So let's dive in. What really jumps out as we look at these different perspectives?
Well, let's start where the sources suggest, with that modern pagan view of nature. It seems crucial for setting the stage.
Right. And the first big takeaway there is that nature isn't just stuff. It's not a resource, not just a pretty view. It's seen as fundamentally sacred, divine even.
It's a direct manifestation of the divine itself, then.
That's the idea. Finding divinity in the elements, the cycles, the sun's energy, the tides, forests, the wind. It's seeing the divine in the natural world.
And making that connection, that's a core spiritual practice for them.
Absolutely. Rituals, often outdoors, meditation, chanting, drumming, maybe dancing. It's all about trying to attune yourself to the earth's energy, its cycles.
Kind of immersing yourself to connect with its wisdom, its energy.
Exactly. Creating a real spiritual link.
But it goes beyond just the landscape, right? The sources talk about a belief in, well, inhabitants, spiritual beings.
Yeah, that's a strong element. Deities, spirits, elemental forces. They're seen as co-creators, part of the world.
And pagans actively try to build relationships with these entities.
Often, yeah, through rituals, offerings, prayers, seeking insight, maybe protection, blessings. Nature is seen as this huge interconnected web.
And all living things are part of that greater whole.
Right. So nurturing that relationship is key to living in harmony with the earth as
Yeah.
they see it.
So the result is this feeling of interconnectedness, harmony, and nature offering wisdom, healing, a sense of belonging.
Yeah, it's a very holistic, deeply reverent way of looking at the world.
Okay, so that's one perspective. Nature as sacred, interconnected, inhabited by divine spirits. But let's jump back thousands of years.
Right. How did ancient cultures see the spirits in nature? Figures like fauns, Pan.
And how does it compare or maybe contrast with the modern view we just discussed?
Well, this is where that popular Mr. Tumnus image starts to unravel a bit.
Yeah. How so?
The article on fauns points out the familiar half-goat, half-man look is largely modern, heavily influenced by C.S. Lewis, apparently,
Yeah.
and not quite right according to the original Roman sources.
That's a key point. So in ancient Rome, fauns were different.
Initially, yeah, they were seen as woodland spirit gods, often offspring or attendants of the Roman deities Faunus and Fauna, and Faunus himself, originally seen as pretty human-like.
No goat legs at first. So where did those come from?
That seems to have been borrowed or maybe transposed from Greek mythology.
Let me guess. Pan.
Exactly. The Greek god Pan, often depicted with goat legs, became intertwined with Faunus as Roman culture absorbed Greek ideas, and those features got passed along to the fauns.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about satyrs? Because they always seem to get lumped in with fauns.
They do, and yeah, the names are totally confused today.
Mhm.
But the ancient texts describe satyrs differently. They were companions of Bacchus Dionysus to the Greeks, the god of wine, revelry. And their features were more varied, maybe ass ears, horse tails, pug noses, but not necessarily half-goat bodies like we picture fauns.
So physically distinct, at least originally. But where the lines blur, and this feels important for later, it's the traits, right? The associations.
Yes, those definitely got mixed up and transferred over time. Satyrs were strongly linked with wine, revelry, debauchery, sexual conquest.
Sounds pretty wild.
It was. The article notes this wasn't seen as purely negative back then, but it represented wildness, excess, a lack of inhibition, a very different vibe from the polite Mr. Tumnus.
Absolutely. That adds a potential darker, maybe untamed edge to these nature spirits that isn't really in the popular view.
And later Greek myths also had the Panes, followers of Pan. They looked more like the Roman fauns, but were seen as a branch of the satyr family.
So were they seen differently, fauns versus satyrs or panes?
Generally, yeah. Roman fauns were often seen as helpful guides in the woods. Satyrs and Panes, though. They could be mischievous, maybe even deliberately obstructive if you ran into them.
So even though they might seem like minor figures now, these ancient nature beings, including fauns in their later forms, had this complex history, aspects of wildness, excess, maybe even a hint of danger.
Definitely not just gentle guardians. There was more lurking there.
Which leads us right to the next question. How did these ancient ideas, these nature spirits with their potential for wildness, maybe a shadow side, how did they end up in unsettling literature like Gothic and horror?
Well, genres like Gothic and horror were sort of the perfect place for them. Gothic lit, starting in the 18th century, was partly reacting against pure rationalism. It was fascinated by the unexplained, the mysterious hidden secrets.
And think about those settings. Dark forests, lonely moors, creepy old houses.
Exactly. They immediately make you think something ancient, something wild, maybe not entirely friendly, could still be lurking just out of sight.
Plus, the genre explored transgression, the darker side of life, much like some of those myths, actually.
And then Gothic evolved into horror fiction, which really doubles down on provoking intense fear, physical, psychological, often using the supernatural, breaking taboos.
And this is where Arthur Machen comes in.
He's a key figure, yeah. Central to what's called weird fiction, kind of a blend of supernatural, sci-fi, horror elements, and a big influence on cosmic horror.
Cosmic horror, that's the one where humanity is just tiny and vulnerable compared to these vast, terrifying, often ancient forces.
Precisely. And those forces can definitely include mythological beings, ancient deities, non-human entities. Perfect fit for Pan.
So the great god Pan is Machen taking these ancient fears and sticking them right into his own time, the umpteenth century, using science alongside mythology.
Exactly. It's a potent mix. He takes these deep-seated ancient fears about nature and the unknown and makes them feel terrifyingly present and modern.
Okay, let's get into the novel itself. How does Machen actually build this horror using these ideas? The setup sounds classic Gothic, but with that scientific twist.
Right. Dimly lit lab, ambitious scientist Dr. Raymond doing this neurological experiment on a young woman, Mary.
And his goal is, well, it's huge. He wants to literally see through the veil, open a door between our world and the supernatural, specifically to see the great god Pan.
And the result is immediate horror. Mary reacts violently, convulsions, terror. The source confirms she does see Pan.
But the real horror doesn't stop with her reaction, does it? It comes from her daughter.
Yes, Helen V. revealed later to be the literal child of Pan. And she's depicted as just deeply disturbing, unnaturally independent, strange, with this unnerving connection to the forest.
And her presence itself causes terror.
Oh, absolutely. It radiates from her. We hear about a boy dying of sheer terror after seeing her with some creature in the woods.
And her friend Rachel.
Permanently changed, withdrawn, haunted after some encounter with Helen. Then there's Herbert, a respectable man who marries her, he's ruined, and dies of terror too.
And isn't there a wave of suicides in London linked to her?
Yes, when she's living there under an alias, Mrs. Beaumont. A string of mysterious suicides among prominent men, all connected back to her influence.
So Villiers, the character who investigates, he's like our detective figure.
Pretty much. He's trying to piece together these horrifying, seemingly separate events that all seem to orbit around Helen.
And the climax, Machen doesn't hold back there, does he?
Not at all. Helen's confrontation and death scene is incredibly unsettling. Her true nature is revealed as hybrid, shifting, transforming form that ultimately dissolves into, well, the text calls it, a dark and gelatinous substance.
Ugh. And Dr. Raymond's final thoughts really drive home the horror.
They do. His realization that human minds just can't handle seeing something like Pan, and that forcing open that door lets this nameless horror take human form.
So Machen uses those classic Gothic setting, woods, old houses, dark London streets. But the fear isn't just a ghost. It's deeper. It's tied to the supernatural, to Pan, lurking just behind that veil.
Exactly. And his narrative strategies are key to making it so effective. The source highlights his use of sensory impact, for instance.
How does that work?
He uses physical sensations described in the text, like the feeling of nausea and exhaustion in that haunted house, or Clark's delirious hallucinations to pull the reader into the character's own fear.
So you feel it with them.
Yeah. And the source points out how often he describes the physical results of terror. Contorted faces, shock, hysteria, people literally dying from fear. He makes the horror visceral through these bodily reactions.
And then there's the technique you mentioned earlier, the ellipses, the power of the unseen.
Ah, yes. Crucial. Machen deliberately leaves those blanks, those 3 dots, at really climactic moments, like when Rachel tells her mother what she saw or the exact details of the experiment before it goes wrong.
Why do that? Why leave things out?
Because it forces your imagination, the reader's imagination, to fill in the horror. What did Rachel really see? Machen doesn't spell it out.
So you have to picture it yourself.
Right. And what you imagine might be far scarier for you, personally, than anything he could explicitly describe. Fear is subjective.
So the reader becomes a co-author of the horror, in a way.
Exactly. He understood that hinting, suggesting, leaving things unknown, that's often much more terrifying than spelling it all out. It taps into primal fear.
He's also a master of atmosphere, isn't he?
Totally. The source mentions how he builds this pervasive sense of suspense, unease, discomfort throughout the whole book. Even when nothing overtly scary is happening, there's this feeling.
A feeling in the air.
Yeah, like that quote about the London suicides. There was horror in the air, each one asking himself whether he would be the next. It reminds me of Lovecraft's idea about needing an atmosphere of suffocating and inexplicable terror.
It's the dread that the horror is everywhere, inescapable, even if you can't pin it down.
Right, and he shows how just encountering the supernatural, personified by Helen, corrupts or destroys people.
It's not just seeing something scary, it's contact with this otherness.
Exactly. It causes this intense, almost polluting horror. People die, or their faces are described as becoming demonic, like lost souls. It links back to those primal fears of the unknown, the non-human, maybe the dangerous wildness we saw in the ancient myths.
And finally, the structure. How does that play into the horror?
Well, the way the story unfolds, with these seemingly separate incidents that Villiers investigates, it works like a detective story. It creates mystery.
And that pulls you in, makes you want to know the answer.
For sure. It drives your curiosity, what Burke called the first and most elementary emotion. You're compelled to follow the clues, uncover the truth, and reach that horrifying climax.
And at that climax, with the explicit description of Helen's death.
Right. Then Machen shifts gears. You're no longer just piecing things together. You're suddenly a direct witness to the full, awful reality. It's a powerful shift.
Okay, let's try and tie these threads together, then. We started with modern paganism seeing nature as sacred, divine, full of benevolent spirits.
Then journeyed back to ancient myths, where nature spirits like fauns and Pan were complex.
Sometimes helpful, yes, but also tied to wildness, excess, maybe even danger.
And then saw how these ideas became really potent fuel for Gothic and horror literature.
And specifically how Arthur Machen, in The Great God Pan, just masterfully wove it all together. Ancient myths, the idea of a hidden supernatural world, the wildness of nature, creating this unique, deeply unsettling horror.
His techniques really stand out, using sensory details, building that suffocating atmosphere, and maybe most importantly, leaving space for your imagination with those ellipses.
Yeah, making the horror personal, internal. He showed that the biggest scares might be in what we don't see, but what we're forced to feel and imagine lurking just beyond our perception. Hugely influential. So the sources really show this fascinating connection, don't they, between the sacred view of nature, the complex, sometimes darker side of ancient myths, and how literature explores our fear of the unknown, the hidden parts of the world.
They're deeply, unsettlingly linked.
So here's something to think about. That idea of a veil between our world and another. The potential for unseen forces to intrude, whether they come from ancient woods or are unleashed by, maybe, scientific arrogance.
Does that still tap into our deepest, most primitive fears today? Could the sacred and the terrifying aspects of nature actually be, well, two sides of the same wild coin?